Now, South Harmon is here, everything done changed. That WoRP tool make you open your brain. Eric Vanek is here, so remember the name. Hey, he got the waiver wire for the week. Tell you who to start and who to give a seat. Dropping the podcast every week. You know the knowledge is elite. After the show, we gon' hold a Lombardi. Celebrating like we throwing a party. This the blueprint and I know they gon' copy. South Harmon intros always go the hardest, cause this is America's game.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another America's Game, episode number 36. I am your host, Eric Vanek, and you can find me on Twitter at Eric Vanek NFL, and I am joined this week by Koopa. Koopa, what's going on, man?
Not too much. Things are going good. Getting to that busy time of the year where if you've got your drafts before the NFL draft, those are going to be starting soon. And
Yeah.
I know in all the South Harmon leagues that have been started over the past couple of years, we've got those pre-NFL rookie drafts, and most of them are starting on April 1st. So I got to make sure I got my rankings in order, got all my for each league, because hey, you know me, I'm using the WoRP tool. I'm changing around which guys I want depending on which league, and I got to make sure I have it all set up and good to go by the time April 1st rolls around.
Yeah, I just noticed that yesterday. I got a couple of those sleeper notifications that says, "Hey, your draft starts in 7 days." I'm like, going to Mike, "Hey, is this correct? Like these leagues you got me into, are they drafting before the NFL draft?" Yep. I'm like, "Fuck. All right. Well, I guess this is what I'm getting into then." So, there's nothing wrong with it. I just prefer to draft after I know their landing spots and all that. But it's okay to have a few leagues, I think, to where you're drafting before the NFL draft, especially if you're, degenerates like me and you.
Hey, I think it's fun to have a few beforehand. The problem is when you join 10 South Harmon leagues, and then you've got 10 of them going, you're like, crap, this is way more than I wanted. But
Yeah.
you roll with it, and I'm gonna have a couple fun drafts here with some of them, and actually a bunch of them I've only got like third and fourth round picks, so I might as well just be planting my flag on some random player and then hoping that he gets drafted, because we don't know what's going to happen that far down the list.
Yeah, I have a few of those guys that I really, really like. Probably at each position I have a guy or two that I really, really like so far. That, like, not getting the mainstream publicity or anything like that. So I could probably snag a few shares of those guys in those drafts. So yeah, that'll be fun.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this week, Koopa, you are the WoRP man, and this week we are doing continuing wide receiver and tight end month here, and we're going to go over wide receiver and tight end WoRP. So for wide receiver WoRP, I would say most of our leagues that we're in are pretty just standard 1 PPR leagues, start 3, and then you got a bunch of flexes, so you could start up to like 6. So there's different, things with lineups that may be changed, but as far as like an actual PPR point, like I'm not in too many leagues where it's, unless it's a full half point PPR league or a full point PPR league, that's basically your standards settings for wide receivers. Tight ends, though, we have a lot of different settings and lineup settings that we can go over, but wide receivers pretty much universal everywhere. The ones that we're going to look at least.
Yeah, the things that tend to happen with wide receivers is the relative values between them kind of stay the same. The difference is just how do the wide receivers compare to the other positions in your league. That kind of determines, do you want to get the higher tier wide receivers or the lower tier wide receivers. But the difference between the top guy and like say the 30th guy is usually going to be around the same amount in terms of like the actual WoRP difference between them. it's just a matter of where are you investing your capital? What are you putting your value into on your team? And if you need to invest high-end capital somewhere else, then you don't have it for the wide receivers and you backfill later.
Right. Absolutely. So our first league we're gonna look at here, we're gonna pop open your screen here. So let me set that up real quick. And I'm gonna go down to share warp screen. There's that. Add that in. Okay, so that's pretty good there. So yeah, just kind of looking at the warp for your first league here, your QDL league. You went over it and told me this is a half PPR league with no tight end premium lineup league. So we can kind of just see this is just a standard half PPR league with no tight end premium. Obviously, you can see these tight ends are way, way, way down here. But as far as like the wide receivers and running backs, they're pretty damn equal.
Yeah, the interesting thing about how half PPR has worked from how I've been looking at it, it kind of meshed with my understanding of how PPR and redraft worked, where half PPR it makes the wide receivers and the running backs about even in terms of when you get through the first 2 or 3 rounds of a redraft a draft, then you're going to have about even amount of running backs and wide receivers that have been taken off the board. When you go to a no PPR, you're going to lean more towards the running backs. When you go to full PPR, you're going to lean more towards the wide receivers. And so you're going to see this because of how WoRP is looking at it from more of a redraft mindset. Yes, we're using it for Dynasty, but the WoRP tool likes to show us in terms of, hey, this is what redraft wise we are looking at. And so I really like looking at the half PPRs as, okay, this is where it's even. And then as we get into higher PPRs and things like that, we're going to see that wide receiver line is usually going to go above the running back line, unless something else is happening in the running back room. Say if they're getting, they're getting like a running back points per carry or something like that. Okay,
Right.
that's going to bump the running backs back up to where the receivers are again.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so like in this standard league that we're looking at here and just half PPR, like I said, the running backs and receivers are, as you can see down the line here, pretty much equal all the way through. Like, I'm sure your top guys, McCaffrey's, your Lambs, Tyreek Hills are a little bit of an outlier compared to the rest. But if you look at the rest of the line for running backs, wide receivers, it's relatively just, overlaps each other the whole way. So in a half PPR league just like this, it's, you can kind of build however you want to build. If, take best player available at those positions. And then obviously half PPR with no tight end premium or anything, you see how much further the tight ends are down. It's literally, here's Kelsey at 1.5. Your top receiver is CD Lamb at 2.9. So it's literally like half. So that's one thing that I using the WoRP tool for a lot of my leagues, you can see really how much valuable the tight end position is, and that's how you can go ahead and prepare for that position in your league. Like if it doesn't matter, like this league, like okay, I'll just roll out a Dalton Schultz here and be fine with it, or a Cole Kmet. I don't have to invest all my capital into a Travis Kelce or a Kyle Pitts or something like that. And then that also means for your draft, rookie draft upcoming here, like I probably don't want to invest in Brock Bowers as high as I got to invest in Brock Bowers in these types of leagues. So I want to be hitting those running backs and wide receivers in these leagues.
Yeah, and this is another case of one of those where I like to say tight ends don't matter.
Right.
And so this kind of league is the perfect scenario where tight ends just are not going to matter. All right, we've got Trey McBride, who a lot of people have as their dynasty tight end number 2. He, in last year in this league, the difference between him and a guy like Chigakonkwo, I guess Chigakonkwo even had a bunch going to him and Gerald Everett. So Trey McBride versus Gerald Everett is the same difference as Brandon Ayuk versus Tyler Lockett.
Yeah.
Like, you have a huge difference between those guys, where if I can take my Trey McBride and turn him into that Brandon Ayuk, I'm having to go all the way down to that Gerald Everett in order to find a difference, the equivalent tight end.
Mm-hmm.
And realistically, you can probably find yourself better. We've got a better than Gerald Everett is Logan Thomas, Taysom Hill, Cade Otton, Jonnu Smith, Isaiah Likely, Darren Waller, Hunter Henry. Like, all those guys, they aren't even in the top 12 tight ends. Nobody in this league is starting those guys on a consistent basis because they're going to be looking at the top 11 tight ends.
Right.
And so all you're doing is sacrificing your ability to choose, hey, I've got this tight end that I have some value sunk into, and I know who I'm starting every single week. And instead, you just turn that around, upgrade your receiver position, have an even more top tier wide receiver, and then just pump in one of these lower tier guys. You're the one that plays the waiver wire every single week. And just a little bit of backroom stuff here. We're recording this probably a little over a week before this comes out. But right around this time, maybe in the next couple days, is going to be the first episode of my podcast. And the second episode of my podcast is going to be walking through the tight ends don't matter strategy and what that looks like over the course of a season. And I'm just going to be going through it every single week. I'm going to be like, this is the player that I'm putting in at my tight end position. I'm not looking at I'm not cherry picking the results. I'll explain it in the episode, but I won't be cherry picking the results. I'll be doing realistic. This is what I did the last year in the 2023 season, and showing you how good of a tight end I'm able to create in warp value just by grabbing guys that are only available on Dynasty waiver wires. I'm not even going to say like, oh, Isaiah Likely, because in redraft he wasn't owned until Mark Andrews went down. But I'm going to say in Dynasty, Isaiah Likely was already owned, so I'm not going to have him on my team. He's not allowable. And so I'm having to pull these Durham Smythes. I'm having to pull these Tanner Hudsons. Like, those are the guys that are filling the lineup spots.
Right.
And you can do that sort of thing and build yourself this A WoRP tight end who's matching that 11th or 12th guy anyway.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what you're wanting to do. You're going to be, at the bottom of the tight ends in your league anyway, so you might as well try like create a monster, like you're saying, to stream 4 or 5 different guys and just get enough to be a tight end 9 to 12 somewhere in there weekly. So that's what you're trying to do. Kind of switching gears for a moment. So you did add the multi-year WoRP selection here on your WoRP tool here from 2019 to 2023. So my question is, have you really looked at say you look at 2023 here and how it wound up? Are a lot of the multi-year charts kind of still reflective of how it really looks from year to year? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, so it is pretty close with the multi-year towards the 2023. 2023 in general tends to be a little bit boosted for the wide receivers in terms of as the further out it goes.
Gotcha.
So the equivalent in multi-year WoRP of, okay, where is wide receiver 34 versus whereas wide receiver 34 in 2023, it's bumped up a little bit.
Gotcha.
So example, that number of wide receivers above 1 in 2023 was 38. In multi-year WoRP, it's only 34.
Gotcha.
So you're getting 4 extra receivers that are above 1 WoRP. You just get a couple little extra guys that are boosted. The quarterbacks are a little bit muted. They tend to fall off a lot sooner in 2023, and so that's kind of reflective of the fact that, okay, there's more receivers that are getting boosted up.
Okay.
But in
Yeah,
general, they're pretty close. And also tight end, it was a really bad year for the top end tight ends in 2023. You didn't have those big your Travis Kelce's and your Mark Andrews either weren't as good the whole year or they got hurt. And so the top tier tight ends, they were still Travis Kelce, it was still TJ Hawkinson, but they didn't get that full year of super high production that we usually get one or two tight ends doing per year.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious if like the charts kind of look the same year after year. Like obviously the names are going to change. You'll have a couple different, um, ways it looks, but for the most part, year to year it looks the same.
Yeah, a
Next,
fun exercise here for anyone listening to this. Go into the warp tool and just start changing the year selector and just walking back through the years. Look at 2023 and then just change it to 2022 and rerun it. Change it to 2021, rerun it. Change it to 20 and just go back and you'll see these lines slowly shift over time.
right.
And understand that multi-year warp is taking the average of all of those lines. And so, but if you have an idea of, okay, they're slowly trending towards this sort of thing. And so one of those has been wide receiver has been slowly trending up. Quarterback has been slowly trending down. That's something that if you project that trend to continue, usually we like to project that things continue until something slaps us in the face and says, nope, we're done with that. Something else is happening. Then you can potentially rely on and bet on, okay, the wide receiver line might be even a twinge higher this coming year. And if I want to invest in the future, maybe it's better to invest in wide receivers. But in a league like we're looking at both previously and what Eric has just pulled up now, tight ends, they don't have any tight end premium. There's nothing. They still aren't going to matter, no matter how much moving up they're going to do, unless we replace like all the wide receivers in the NFL with tight ends, and we know that'll never happen.
Right. All right. Yeah. So this next league that you brought to us here, this is another half PPR league, no tight end premium, but this one is a best ball league. So you can see it changes a little bit. I'm guessing the quarterback scoring is a little more juiced up in this league, but if you look at the running backs, wide receivers, they're pretty much overlapping each other pretty much the whole time again. And the tight ends are actually a little bit more boosted in this one. I'm guessing it's just because it's best ball and you're getting those random spike weeks from a Colby Parkinson, a Luke Musgrave, a Taysom Hill are up there. Because if you look at it here's Taysom Hill. He's up here at tight end number 7 when before he was in the 20s, I believe, in the lineup league.
And so some of that is a result of a warp.
Right.
So Taysom Hill in 2023, people were not starting him at the beginning of the season. And then it was like week 3 or week 4, he had this like explosion, like 35-point game. And in best ball leagues, you captured that warp because you likely had him rostered. You just didn't have him you weren't expecting him to be a top 12 tight end, so you didn't put him in your lineup. Whereas in lineup leagues, you missed out on that explosion week.
Right.
And so then he didn't get all that warp value.
Right. Yeah.
And
so yeah, go ahead.
Just to confirm something for anyone that was curious, this league, it is 6 points per passing touchdown, whereas the previous league was 4. That's the reason that the quarterbacks are boosted up.
That's a huge difference.
But in general, you kind of see how you can play with all these not great tight ends in a best ball league. The slope gets extremely flat, like even at the top end on the top 6 guys. Like if you were looking at the lineup league, it had a steep curve and then it flattened out. In this league, it's kind of a flat curve that before it like steepens a little bit out after the top 6 guys and then it flattens off again.
Right.
And so you see that that sort of thing in 2023's data. Obviously, if you're looking at multi-year, you're going to see the standard curve that it's going to be steeper at the beginning and flatten out as time goes on. But the difference between your tight end 6 and your tight end 18 isn't that much. And if you have tight end 18 and 22 and 35, those guys are going to hit your lineup enough, and they're going to have their own good weeks. And because it's best ball, they're going to take that single tight end spot that you need to fill, and they're going to do just fine compared to that tight end number 6. And
Absolutely.
so it's another one of those situations where having those top tier guys, really what you want is to have those top tier guys for their explosion weeks. So a guy that's almost more valuable in terms of value to your team versus their cost is a guy like George Kittle, because Kittle tends to be this tight end where he either catches a bunch of passes for a ton of yards and a couple touchdowns, or he'll catch 2 passes for 30 yards. And in a best ball league, that's perfect because you're capturing those weeks that he does really well. And then if you have a couple of these lower tier tight ends, one of them might fire and hit 4 catches for 50 yards and may or may not have a touchdown. But that'll help cover for George Kittle's bad weeks. And then when George Kittle does have that good week, he's going to help make sure that you win.
So, kind of if you're in a league like this, especially for the tight end position, if you look here, TJ Hawkinson was the top tight end, 1.5. Travis Kelce, 1.5 as well. Okay, so we go down to 1.0. Taysom Hill, 0.98. Trey McBride, 0.98. Dalton Schultz, players like that. If I got Kelce, if I got Hawkinson, I got any of these guys, Kittle, I'm trying to trade those guys and see if I can get some running backs or wide receivers in a league where the tight end is just so close like this. Literally that 0.5 just does not matter. I'm going to go ahead and just best ball these tight ends to death. I'm going to go get Colby Parkinson this year. I'm going to go get Jonnu Smith on the Dolphins this year. I'm going to get guys like that and just best ball my way to the tight end spot. I'm not going to, I'm going to go trade the guy that thinks, Travis Kelce's going to have another big season. Yeah, he might, but the WoRP difference between those guys is just not going to be any different. Whereas if I can trade Kelce for, like you said, a Brandon Ayuk, a James Cook, whoever I can trade him for, the WoRP difference I'm getting from that running back or wide receiver is going to mean a lot more to me than that tight end WoRP is going to mean to me.
Yeah, and one other thing about this league, because I just pulled it up and remembered, this is actually a 2 tight end league. So not only are we saying, hey, tight ends don't matter, whatever, we're still starting 2 of them every single week. And even with that, we're going, hey, we want to throw in an amalgamation of these lower tier guys. In terms of how I have my team in this league actually built, I do actually have Travis Kelce. Part of that is just because I have Patrick Mahomes. And when I have a 2 tight end best ball league, I tend to like to try and get one higher tier guy because I know I have to fill 2 spots. Whereas if I'm trying to fill it with these lower tier guys, I end up having to put so many roster spots into getting 2 decent lower tier options into my starting lineup that it starts to hamper my strategy of I find I myself am really good at identifying those wide receiver 4s that are going to have decent weeks or that are going to pop. And if I have to put too many roster spots into tight ends, I limit my ability to have those wide receiver 4 types. And this league specifically, I think we're a roster 26 or 25 or something like that. So I don't have the ability to easily put 8 spots into getting a bunch of tight ends.
Gotcha.
So that's something how a league like this, you kind of adjust around a little bit based on the parameters. Yes, we're talking about tight ends don't matter, but I've gotten Travis Kelce onto this team and made it work. And so you just kind of have to balance around with the settings of your league. This is a case where those roster requirements ended up impacting. Because even though I was saying, hey, tight ends don't matter, just give me a bunch of best ball tight ends at the end, I'm actually going a tier higher than that because I don't have the roster spots like we do in some of like the later leagues we'll be talking about, where you've got 35, 40 roster spots. And so you can afford to roster the third tight end on the New York Giants if you want.
Right. All right, next league we're going to look at here, your NFL Legends Dynasty League. So this one is a lineup league, straight 1 PPR with no tight end premium. So in this one, obviously with the full PPR now, the wide receivers take over the running backs just a little bit. It's still fairly close. They do overlap in a couple spots, but especially when you get towards the end here, back in like the 30 range, 24 to 48 range, the wide receivers take over there. And then in the early stages here, we're kind of looking at running back, wide receiver, kind of not too far off from each other. McCaffrey dominated. He was at a 3 WoRP, and in a full PPR league like this, CD Lamb was right there at 2.9. So he was kept up with Christian McCaffrey in this league. And then kind of just looking down at the tight ends, especially with this one with no tight end premium. Hawkinson and Kelsey had some good years, but just look at the difference between running backs and wide receivers compared to these tight ends. It's still nice to have one of these elite guys if you had one. You got Evan Ingram up here who had a shit ton of catches like normal. And Joku had a really good PPR type year. Kittle, Kmet was up there. Trey McBride, those kinds of guys who caught a bunch of balls. They're going to be up here at the top of the tight end ward, but it's still not that big of a difference. Now, compared to like earlier, though, how we were talking about in the half PPR, it's your Isaiah Likely, your Hunter Henrys, Gerald Everett, Logan Thomas types. It's probably a little bit of a difference here between, Logan Thomas's 0.38 to Kelsey's 1.5. So it's a little bit of a bigger difference, especially in a lineup league. I probably would want to have, at least a decent guy here, somewhere in the top 12 range, top 15 range is probably where I'm aiming for to get, my tight end in those leagues. And then the next league we're going to look at will be a best ball league, so we can kind of, compare it from there.
Yeah, I'm still of the opinion that I'm going to play best ball, like in the best ball tight end range in a lineup. So I'm fully into the tight ends don't matter. That's partially just because I am 100% okay starting the random guys. I also think that if we didn't have an awesome waiver wire podcast that was going into these dynasty tight ends of, hey, who got the 40% snap share with 3 targets this past week, it'd be a little harder to do that effectively. But that's something that you have to understand. Okay, this is what I'm going to be investing into. So it's something where, hey, if you aren't comfortable going down into that range, okay, get yourself a tight end in that 12 to 15 range and run with that guy. But I'm going to play it to the extreme. I'm going to really invest in how can I really have no value into the tight end? How can I get myself having Tanner Hudson in my starting lineup every single week? How can I get myself into having Brevin Jordan in my lineup to cover the week that Tanner Hudson's on bye? Like stuff like that, and putting that value into the wide receivers. Gotcha. That's how I want to build my team in this kind of league, because that allows me to not need to worry about the tight end position, except for that I'm playing the waiver wire. I'm the only person in this league that is week after week making a tight end move. Who's going to fight you over a tight end on the waiver wire? Like, nobody. The tight ends don't really matter in this league. Anyone that's worth any amount of value is already owned. So essentially, you're playing the whole rest of your league with every single tight end in the NFL minus like the top 35, 40 guys. And so you can find a lot of gems in that in those guys that are outside of the top 35 and 40 that, okay, this is the week that they're going to do really well because their timeshare partner's hurt, or the starter in front of them is hurt, or you kind of play around injuries, or, hey, this tight end room that we didn't know anything about that It was just a bunch of people hemorrhaging targets from each other. Well, it looks to have cleared up, and somebody is actually getting 70% of the snaps rather than 3 people having 35%.
Right.
And so things like that are what you want to pay attention to, and then you can find these guys that are able to hit your lineup from that point. But when you look at it from an AWORP perspective, like I talked about mentioned Tanner Hudson because he's down there at rank 27. Well, that's because in AWORP, Tanner Hudson is not started that many weeks. In fact, AWORP has him started only 4 weeks over the course of the season. And so if you started him more than just those 4 weeks, in the case of Tanner Hudson, I think he had like 8 or 9 viable weeks over the course of the season. I'm just count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, so he had nine weeks over the course of the season where I have him marked down as these are weeks that I would have considered starting Tanner Hudson. You're able to accumulate the warp from those weeks that aren't even showing up in the tool here.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so that's going to be something that I mentioned the tight ends don't matter episode. I'm going to be talking through that, what that looks like, how much warp I am able to capture from playing that strategy that does not show up in the tool.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, we'll go over to the best ball league now, and that is going to be Dynasty Best Ball. So let's find that league, calculate. Yeah, so in best ball, you're going to have more of those tight end options, obviously, that come through for you here, and the drop from Hawkinson to these other guys is not that steep compared to the previous one we just looked at for the lineup league. Wide receivers still are pretty much over the running backs in every single spot here. So this is the league where I want every single wide receiver that I possibly can start every single week. If I have, start 3 receivers and I have 3 flex spots, I want to be starting 6 wide receivers every single week if humanly possible. Obviously, in a best ball, you don't have that luxury to pick who you're going to start, but hey, if you got a running back that pops in, awesome. But most of those weeks I want to be filling with 6 wide receivers. So if I'm doing a startup with these settings, I'm going to be hammering wide receiver early and often. Obviously, you still want to get your quarterbacks in the super flex too, but I'm going to be hammering. Wide receivers are probably going to be my first 6, 7 picks, and obviously throw a quarterback or 2 in there as well.
Yeah, and I just this league is one of those where it's like, okay, not only do I want to invest in wide receivers because it's best ball, like any wide receiver can make your lineup. It's one of those things where now I'm fighting over how good of a running back do I need? Because in best ball, usually you want to have those better running backs. You have the weaker wide receivers because anyone can fire. But if I can have those good wide receivers, that's where the warp value is. And so you're trying to strike this balance of, can I have enough running backs in order to have a best ball fill of those guys, but the top end points are coming out of my wide receiver position. So it kind of flips on its head the way I traditionally think about best ball leagues. And then we're looking at tight ends, and once again, tight ends don't really matter. We're looking at these tight ends are just they're there. Yeah, toss a couple guys at the wall, and some of them stick. This one it is in fact a single tight end league, and so just all right. You potentially have one guy that you toss in, and you throw them into there. And so like my team, I currently have T.J. Hawkinson on it. If it weren't for the fact that he was injured, I'd be looking at getting rid of him. But my team in the position that it's in, I earned the 104 last year, but I have a nice stable of wide receivers. I've got a T. Higgins, DK Metcalf, Drake London, Christian Watson. I've got these guys that are decent. That's what drew me up to the 104 instead of earning like the 101 or the 102. But I'm going to be looking at in sometime in the future, let me move TJ Hawkinson and get another wide receiver. I don't need this good tight end. I can fill him in with a bunch of these other guys. I can fill him in with your Johnny Munts, with your Tommy Trembles, your Jeremy Ruckerts, your Chiga Conquos. Like, those guys can make up for a TJ Hawkinson because I only need one of them to fire any given week.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's mostly what all these tight ends are in a lot of these leagues, especially in best ball. Like, you just need one to hit that week. You need K. Dotton to catch the 2 touchdown passes, or Hunter Henry catches 2 touchdown passes, and you're in the ball game. You're probably in top 2 or 3 of tight end in your league scoring that week. So that's definitely one you want to be looking at for sure. All right. So next one we're going to look at here, Best Ballers 2. Pull that one up. So this one is a 1 PPR with a 1.75 tight end premium on this one. So as you can see here, with adding that 1.75 tight end premium in this league, it boosts those tight ends right up here. You see Hawkinson and Kelsey were better than the second running back overall, which is Kyron Williams.
Yeah, and that's even with it being the down year for tight ends that it was last year. If you're looking at a multi-year WoRP, the top positions in order are running back 1, wide receiver 1, quarterback 1, tight end 1. Clear right there. If you have the top guy at any position, you have one of the top 4 players in the league.
Exactly.
And so a league like this, it's still a best ball. So you can still play some of the tight end best ball strategy of having these lower tier guys. But now you can start also playing the idea of, hey, some of these guys can enter my flex. Your tight end 12 is the equivalent of wide receiver 30. So if you've got maybe tight end 15, and we're talking, hey, you need to start 3 receivers, but tight end 15, if that guy fires the same week as, say, your tight end, if you have tight end number 4, if he fires the same week, he can easily fill a flex spot, and he'll push out a wide receiver no problem. And so that's why, like, 1.75 is around that range where, hey, these tight ends really do matter, and you want to have these second tier guys, even if you're getting down into the tight end 32 range. Tight end 32 is still the equivalent of, let me do some quick math, it's still the equivalent of like wide receiver 70. And we're talking in best ball leagues, you want to have way more than wide receiver 70. Wide receiver 70 is only the top two wide receivers on every team in the NFL. We're rostering all those wide receiver 3s in our best ball leagues because those guys are primed to fire. Well, I just told you that that equivalent of wide receiver 70 in this league of best ball 1.75 tight end PPR is the equivalent of having the best tight end on every single team. So some of these second tight ends, some of these guys that are in those timeshares. We had the Seattle timeshare that was horrible. If you were in a lineup league that didn't have a tight end premium, you had the Colts one last year as well.
Seahawks, Colts, and Bengals were the 3 last year.
Yeah, the Bengals were also horrible. But you can have those guys, and they can actually be worth it in this league. They'll give you a couple weeks. They can be there at the end of your roster, and it's not a waste. Whereas I would say in all of the other leagues that we talked about earlier, those guys probably are a waste. Like they are not going to fire and be good enough in terms of being like, okay, yeah, I'm confident in my tight end room with these guys being on my team.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you said, especially in best ball, man, like you just, you have a random Isaiah Likely that's sitting on your roster, and he's going to be in there for a bunch of weeks. Jawan Johnson comes out of nowhere. Tyler Higbee has a week. So those guys can even fit into your flexes, like you said, especially in a higher little premium tight end league like this as well. And then, the wide receiver is pretty much king in this league still, too. And then add in the fact that the tight ends are right on par there with the running backs pretty much. At least, the top 12 or so is compared to the top 12 running backs. Like, running backs really don't matter that much in this league to me. Maybe once you get outside that top 12, tight end range, then I would probably prefer RB13, RB14, RB15, and then wide receivers. They're just gonna you want to start as many of those as possible. But for the running backs, I don't really need to have. Maybe need to have like 3 or 4 solid ones I can depend on weekly, and that's probably it for me.
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting looking at the multi-year versus the single year warp
Sure, I'll
in
pull
this
that up
league,
real quick.
because the multi-year for this league happens to be that tight end line is in fact lower than the running backs still. So you're talking about, hey, the top 12 of like running backs versus tight ends in 2023, they were pretty close. In if you do multi-year 2019 through 2023, there's still a gap between them. It's not a significant one, nowhere near what it was in all the other leagues we've looked at so far. But there is still a little bit of one, and so that's where, yeah, you still want to play a little bit of that tight end best ball strategy. But these guys are still worth it in that tight end 3 is higher than running back 6. You have tight end 4 is higher than running back 7. Tight end 5 is higher than running back 8. And so those are the sorts of things like, okay, now that I'm looking at it this way, when I'm looking at a startup, if I have a young tight end that I know is going to end up in that consistently in that tight end 6-7 range year after year, like I'm trying to stay away from Trey McBride and Sam Laporta because I feel like they've gone insanely high. But a guy like a Cole Kmet, like that, it feels like he's been in the league for years because he kind of has, but he came into the league at like he was 21, I think.
Yeah.
He was 20 or 21, and so even though he's been in the league for 5 years, he's still only like 26. Like he's got plenty of years ahead of him. And what's he shown
He probably
us?
hasn't even hit his prime yet.
Yeah, he's going to consistently be in that tight end 6 through tight end 12 range. And that's a perfect kind of guy where he's going to get pushed down because he's a little lower in the tight end ranks, and people are going to be like, oh, these tight ends, like they're going to be going for their Saquon Barkleys. They're going to be going for their James Cooks and their Tony Pollards and guys like that. And it's like, well, if you get Cole Kmet, you're beating those guys.
Right.
And so, and not only are you beating those guys in production, you're beating them in number of years they're going to be in the league. So you're winning on every single front. And so that's the sort of thing where you get into this 1.75 tight end PPR, you get into this best ball, and it just kind of all flows in together.
Looking for, there it is. Let's do single year. All right.
So this next,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this next league that we're pulling up. So this is Dynasty Dealers. This is a half PPR, 2 tight end, no tight end premium. This is a lineup league. So this is basically to show you, okay, what does it look like when we have 2 tight ends in our lineup requirements now? And what's kind of interesting about this league is how the tight ends get so flat so quick, but because you're forced to start 2 tight ends every single week, everyone kind of gets pushed up a little bit.
Right.
And so if you compare it to, okay, what was our half PPR single tight end, the warp value for each tight end is way lower. And so what I like to do in this sort of league and how I'm going to roster construct with these tight ends is I want to have one guy that I'm confident with in my starting lineup. Can I get one guy that's in that top 6 to 8 range or even higher? Then I want to take my second spot and try to play that, all right, any tight end off the waiver wire sort of thing. But you have to be aware that everyone else is also probably going to be doing that. So you need to be a little more aggressive. Like you in your lineup leagues where it's a single tight end, I was talking about picking up those Tanner Hudsons, picking up the Brevin Jordans, like
Kylan
those guys.
Bransons, right.
Some of those guys might get owned pretty quickly, or they might already be rostered. And so you have to be much more aggressive. You might have to make some trades where I have done it in this league where I made a trade where it basically felt like I I was making the trade of one player for another player. I traded like a wide receiver for a running back or something. But it was just to be a lateral move there in warp and just to get a tight end kicker back that I wanted.
Gotcha.
And so I was able to get this extra tight end that didn't really have barely any value compared to the two players actually in the deal. But all I wanted was, okay, now I need to get this tight end on my team because he's going to be my second tight end for a little bit.
For a little bit, right? That makes sense. Yeah, so like you could have did that last year, trade, Ayuk and Kyron Williams for each other, and maybe you got Jonnu Smith back or something. Jonnu played for a couple of weeks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha,
And you're doing something like that where, okay, this guy that was on some team where they lucked themselves into this tight end, like let me see if I can get him onto my team, which was competing and trying to boost up that second tight end spot because I didn't have anyone on the waiver wire that I could go get. It was much harder for me to get all of these guys off of the waiver wire that's like, oh yeah, this guy, he got 60% snap share. Well, there's somebody else in the league also paying attention to that, and so then I was having to invest fab into it, and you start getting to a point where it's like, okay, it might just be easier to trade for some of these guys.
Right. And then, like you said, this is a half PPR with two tight ends that you're starting, and look how closer that those tight ends are compared to the wide receivers and running backs from the very first couple leagues that we looked at. So it's a huge difference when you go to the two tight end leagues. So I agree with you on that. And then probably the same strategy I would go with if I could get a Kelsey, Laporta, whatever, here to start, be my main guy that I can focus on every single week. And then that second tight end, I can get the Jonnu Smiths, the Kylan Gransons, Colby Parkinsons of the world, and, hopefully get a solid tight end too there. So I like that strategy for this league.
Yeah, and the other thing you have to notice as well is just notice how flat it is. Once you get past that top grouping of tight ends, like I like to call it that top like 8 range or so, it really becomes something where it's just whatever guy you're putting in as long as he's got the opportunity that week. And so in a dynasty league, you can rely on that a little bit more to be, okay, there's going to be some rebuilders. So maybe the number of teams that's competing is only 8. So anyone outside of the tight end 16 is free game because those rebuilders are just going to be like, yeah, please take this random tight end. I'll take the value in a 3rd round pick or something like that. Mm-hmm. But you just have to be aggressive in that spot where you did not need to be aggressive at all when you had the single tight end.
Right. Okay. Next league up, we're going to look here at your tight end extravaganza league. This is a half PPR league with 1 tight end premium and then starting 2 tight ends as well in a lineup league. So on this one, you can definitely see the running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, that top 6 at each position is pretty damn close. I mean, obviously your running back 1, wide receiver 1, 2, RB2 is a little bit more important, but these tight ends, these top 6 tight ends, are right on par with running back, wide receiver 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, and just to clarify something, so it is a 1 tight end PPR. So it's a half point tight end premium, but since it's half PPR, it's 1 PPR for the tight ends in this league.
Right.
I'm that's kind of my fault for writing the notes that way for Eric. But I like to write anytime I'm writing the settings for a league, I like to write what the PPR is for the tight ends. Because sometimes you have the league where it's half PPR, but then it's a bonus of 1 for the tight end. But that means it's 1.5 points per catch. Okay, so to clear it up, I just always write things in terms of tight end PPR. And I'd love for that to be the movement in the community too. So if you're out there writing questions to me for your leagues, I'd love to see it in terms of tight end PPR and not tight end premium. It just means you got to use 2 more characters on that tweet to put the PR at the end.
Right.
But yeah, this league is another one of the ones where, yeah, I want to have that top tier guy, but you can just look at how flat it gets, and with just how it is between, okay, what is the difference between that tight end 12 and the tight end 34? A good example of this is actually if you pull up the A WoRP per game graph, you'll see how there's just gets so flat in that range that you don't really have much of a difference between those guys. So you can get yourself okay, let me get the Daniel Bellinger for a couple games, and I'm getting almost half the warp of that game as if I was putting Dalton Schultz. But we all know Dalton Schultz, especially in a 2 tight end league, he was hard to acquire. Like if you were trying to acquire him, you could sell him for a decent premium. Like you could easily get a 2nd round pick out of Dalton Schultz, if not get a little bit more, depending on how much people are valuing tight ends in that league. I know this one we valued tight ends a ton, but to the point we had 2 of them drafted in the first round at the startup when this league was first created, and I was one of the 2 that did that, and I kind of regret it a little bit because seeing this warp chart, I'm like, I guess I've got my Mark Andrews, so I've got my top guy, but I didn't need to spend a 1st round startup pick on him.
Right.
And so that's the sort of thing where it's all value relative, and because it's a lineup league, because you can find some of these guys off waivers or off the bottoms of other teams and things like that. I want to not invest. I don't want to have a tight end room of Kelsey and Andrews. I don't need that kind of value sunk into the tight end position. I would rather take one of those 2 guys, realistically probably Andrews, with how the dynasty market has shaped up around those 2 guys, and turn them into one of these other receivers. Can I turn him into I could very easily turn him into Mike Evans plus I'm trying to find another good guy, a Mike Evans and a Joe Mixon. Like I'm sure if you offered somebody that in this league, Mark Andrews for Mike Evans and Joe Mixon, that'd be an absolute smash. And I've just picked a wide receiver and running back that had similar warp value to him last year.
Right. That makes sense.
So I've just gotten 2 guys. So I've gotten an extra ton of warp compared to Mark Andrews just by going for those 2 guys.
And it is start 2, so everyone's thinking, got to have that guy, that Mark Andrews. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yep.
All right. And then wide receiver, running back, pretty much the same here. So you don't have to go super crazy on the wide receivers as much, but you're still going to want to have quite a bit. Even in PPR, I probably would rather have them. But looking at it from the even the regular A WoRP for the full year, pretty even wide receiver, running back wise again, even in a full PPR, which is kind of interesting.
Yep.
All right, next one up here we're going to look at is this one.
Yeah, so Best Bro Dynasty. So this one is actually kind of interesting. So it is a 1 PPR with 2 tight end PPR, but there's also points per catch for different distances. So effectively it becomes a 1.25 PPR with a 2.25 tight end PPR, because even a catch from 0 to 4 yards gets an additional 1/4 of a point. And then it tiers up from there. So I think it's 5. I'm pulling it up here as I'm talking, but it's 5 through 10 gets you 1/2 a point, and 10 through 14 gets you, I think it's 1.5. So 0.25, 5 through 9 is 1/2 a point. 10 through 19 is 1. 20 through 29 and 30 through 39 and 40 plus is all 1.5.
Okay.
So you kind of get these tiers of receptions where, yeah, if you're if your wide receiver or tight end catches a pass that is 20 yards, then you're getting 2.5 points just for that reception. And if it was a tight end, add on another point.
Gotcha.
So these larger passes are more rewarded. Obviously, your running backs aren't going to get as many of those, so they're going to be pushed down a little bit more. But you see the tight ends come up because of that one tight end premium, which boosts them up compared to all the other positions. Mm-hmm. But when I'm looking at this kind of league, okay, this is another one of those. I want to have lots of good receivers. We see the receivers are matching the quarterback line here. And I can still play a decent amount of that best ball tight end game. I can get a bunch of these, okay, the tight ends 12 through 24. That's a pretty flat range of guys that I can use to match some of those guys that are maybe in that tight end 5 or 6 range. As long as I have enough of them. And so essentially what you're doing is you're playing that market of, hey, what does everyone else in my league value tight ends 12 through 24? Well, half of them barely know the guy's name, so they're just gonna they're gonna assume that they're worth a third because they've never thought about trading for them. They're like, why are you even asking? And so if you can do that in a league like this, you can build yourself that tight end room so that way you don't need to go around and ask them for, hey, I'd love to have like Evan Ingram or David Njoku or George Kittle, because they know those names. They know those guys are worth a lot. And they're like, oh, this league's got a bonus of 1 reception for tight ends. Like, it's minimum 2.25 PPR. Like, I can't possibly part with Kittle for less than a first and a future third. Like,
right.
And then you're like, well, I don't want to spend that because you want to spend that on a wide receiver.
Exactly. Yep.
So that's the sort of thing that's how you help balance it out in a league like this where, okay, I'm trying to get a bunch of tight ends in this lower range, kind of like we've been talking about. Like, this entire show has basically been get all these lower tier tight ends because nobody values them, but they aren't that different than the edge of the guys that people do value.
Right.
And that's kind of the tight end position. If there's some instances where you want to have the super top tier guys, and that's mostly when you're starting 2 tight ends. Because if you have it, because it's hard to get 2 lower tier guys to fire every single week. So if you can limit it down to 1, then you, with having 1 really solid guy as your first tight end. That's ultimately the picture of what we're looking at here, this whole show with the tight end position.
For sure. All right, so let's go ahead and look at our next league here. It's going to be the South Harmon Dynasty Degenerates League. And there it is. Calculate WoRP on this one.
Yeah,
so this one. Go ahead.
Yeah, this league, it's another one of those, okay, best ball have a lot of value into the tight ends. This is one that I like pulling up just because it is kind of crazy with the running back scoring, so you want to put all the value into running back. But it's fun talking about the other positions in terms of what's the minimum value that I want to be able to put into that position. And so the way I took it with this league is, okay, let me get a bunch of those tight ends that are in that, like, I went for targeted 18 to 36. And so that was my range of, can I get guys that are in this range because it is a 1 PPR, a 2.5 tight end PPR, and it is a start 2 tight end. So I forewent the top tier tight ends in my build just because I knew the rest of the league wasn't going to value running back as much as I was going to.
Right.
And so I had some weeks where my second tight end was really bad, where like I was getting like I was getting
like
a guy that was a single catch for like 8 yards, and it was like, all right, I guess that's what I got. I got 3.3 points this week, but I made up for it because I had all these running backs on my team, and so you have to kind of play with figuring out what is your minimum. Like, even in this league, it's 2.5 tight end PPR. Like, you want to try and have some of these better guys that are, because like if a tight end goes out there and he catches 4 passes, that's 10 points.
Exactly.
Like, you aren't even counting the yards, no touchdowns, nothing. You're at a 10-point tight end if he just catches 4 passes over the course of the week. And that's not anything to scoff at, and that's something that can make a huge difference to your team. But a lot of those guys that are going to consistently score you, catch 4 passes, score you all those points, those guys are a lot harder to come by, especially when the league starts looking at it as, oh, this is 2.5 tight end PPR. We got to start 2 tight ends. Like, everything in their head is saying these top tier guys, like, they're top tier. And we see that in the WoRP chart. Like, they're top tier matching up with the running backs and the wide receivers, or the quarterbacks and the wide receivers. The running backs are just on another level. And so I decided I'm just going to forego having the top wide receivers, having the top quarterbacks, having the top tight ends, get all those running backs to have an absolute dominant team at that position. But I had to cut it off. I had to say, all right, once I have myself, I think this league I ended up going with, it was like 8 or 9 running backs, because this league's also a start 16. So we have a ton of flex spots. So I had a running back for every single spot that I could put a running back in +1. That was my limit at the running back position. And then I invested into all the other positions at that point. And so it's important to find that balance of, okay, I'm targeting tight ends in this 18 to 36 range. By targeting so many running backs, I ended up pushing myself out of the wide receiver range. Like, I all my wide receivers, I think, are outside of the top 50 in Dynasty. Like, I don't think I have a single guy that's in that range. But it was just an element of, okay, I want to have these running backs over these wide receivers. And I had got all my running backs into the top 36 range. So there we go. I know that I'm getting the value there. Gotcha. And so you're just trying to figure out, okay, how do I want to roster construct, even though everything is pointing to these guys matter finally. They're finally a difference to your team. But really, the only difference is, yeah, the top tier guys are worth a lot more compared to the lower tier guys, but relative to another position, they're all worth nothing.
Right. I mean, even kind of just looking at the WoRP per game graph here, like, if I'm assuming this was a super flex league, like, starting a second quarterback probably isn't ideal.
Well, this is actually a 2 quarterback league. So you need to start a second quarterback.
To start 2. Gotcha. Okay.
But even with the need to start a second quarterback, like, the quarterbacks weren't. It just needed to be a second quarterback. It didn't need to be a guy that was good. My team's quarterbacks were Geno Smith and Derek Carr. I just got lucky when the playoffs came around. I also happened to have Joe Flacco and Jake Browning on my team. And so those guys did pretty good there championship week, and those were my 2 quarterbacks in my lineup. But I didn't have a lot invested into the quarterbacks. I mean, I'm going to try and run back and win the championship again this year, but I'm running into the season. I'm going to have 2 starting quarterbacks, and that's it. That's fine. I don't need a third guy because I'm going to have 2 guys putting up some amount of points. Now, if I had the luxury of having extra value sitting somewhere on my team, sure, I might want to get a third quarterback, but in my case, I don't have that. I spent my 24 firsts already. I spent my 25 firsts. I spent even all my seconds and thirds. My next picks are either 4th, 5th, or 26s. Gotcha. And so, yeah, I'm just going to run with what I have, and we'll see how it plays out. I have the running backs that I think it's going to be fine, and but my tight end room is still going to be that sort of, all right, Chig Okonkwo, Daniel Bellinger, Steven Sullivan, Tommy Tremble, Noah Fant, Johnny Mundt. there's a tight end room for you that I'm rolling in. I'm prepared to roll into the season with that. And I'm not scared of that because compared to what I would need to do in order to get a tight end who's a difference maker at the tight end position, I'm going to have to spend way too much and destroy my roster construction.
Right. Yeah, because if I look at this league as like if it was just super flex and not start two quarterbacks, I'm probably just going. I'll just find one really solid quarterback. If I could get, even if it's like Jared Goff, I'll just roll with Jared Goff as my one guy. Second guy, maybe I can get, like Derek Carr later on, one of those very back end quarterbacks, and that'll be my quarterback room. And I'd be hammering the running backs and just start as many running backs as humanly possible. And then, like you said, you got to still, do pretty decent at your tight ends. You're going to have to grab a couple of them late. But if you can get one or two solid guys, that's not bad either.
Yeah, and that's what I'm hoping in my case. I'm hoping Chigakonkwo and Daniel Bellinger might be able to be that.
Right.
And so...
Yeah, I mean, if Darren Waller
one of those
retires,
guys,
that's big.
Yeah, if one of those guys gets in there, Noah Fant is somebody that Adam's been saying over and over again. Hey, Noah Fant, he might be poised to have a breakout year now that all the other tight ends that were in that tight end room there in Seattle are, now that they've left, Noah Fant is the one guy left standing, and so he might. If you were to combine all the Seattle tight ends from last year into one player, that one player was a really good tight end. It's just it was split among three physical guys, and so we didn't get the fantasy points for him.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was saying the same thing on Fant back in January when free agent. I knew he's going to be a free agent. Like, if he goes anywhere, he's going to be pretty damn good wherever he ends up, and just happened to go back to Seattle, but hey, the rest of the room cleared out, so Noah Fant should be sitting pretty good this year. Last week we're going to look at is, if I can find it,
Shit Savage is...
There it is. Okay.
So this one is actually kind of interesting in terms of its lineup requirements. Its lineup requirements are one quarterback, one running back, one wide receiver, and then like 11 flexes.
Yeah.
So you don't even need to start a tight end, but it is a 1 PPR, and then tight ends are 3 PPR. So for every catch that a tight end gets, they get 3 points. So you think about that. Okay, if a tight end has a week that is 3 catches for 35 yards, well, that's a 12.5 point week. Like that's something that can actually come into the bottom of your lineup, especially because we're starting so many guys over the course of the week. And so with Shit Savage, this is something where I like to play with this part of the graph. Not as many people do this, especially when it's a best ball league. But if you on the graph portion, you hover over it on the top right, you can choose a pan mode, okay. And just start panning to the right, and just look to see how long the tight end line stays alive, that it stays above 0.
Yeah.
All right. So
104.
Now, so 104. So we have 104 tight ends that at some point over the season made your lineup.
Wow.
Like, all right, now let's do the math. How many teams are there in the NFL? There's 32. All right, so if we do 3 tight ends per team, that's 96. So we have more than 3 tight ends per team that were valuable in this league at some point over the course of the season. Like that's a ton of value that you can find at the tight end position, especially when a lot of people don't even know who the top tight ends in the NFL are after the first 20.
Right.
Like everyone 21 through even like 80, or let's condense it. Every tight end 40 through 80. If you go through and research it, you might be the only person in your league in a standard lineup league that even knows who any of those guys are.
Yeah.
But in this league, every single one of
Munt?
those guys is pretty valuable. Like they're worth it over getting wide receiver 110.
Yeah.
Like, and we're talking wide receiver 110. That's where you're starting to roster those wide receiver fours, those guys that like you're like, oh yeah, the Olamide Zacchaeus, like that guy, I know who he is, or Greg Dortch, like I know who he is. Like those guys that if you've played in a bunch of best ball leagues, you know who those guys are, but you might not know who these second tight ends. You might not know who your Julian Hills are. You might not know who like a decent number of people probably know who Greg Dulcich is, but
Right.
your Noah Grays, your Tommy Trembles, Brevin Jordan has had a couple weeks, so but like your
Ben
Connor
Sims,
Haywards,
Charlie Kohler.
Connor Haywards was one of my favorite pickups from this past year because nobody knew who Connor Hayward was, but he had a great couple weeks there in the middle of the season,
Right.
And those are the kinds of guys that can be really valuable in this league from a WoRP perspective and mean absolutely nothing in value. Like if somebody tried to come to me and offer me Connor Hayward, I'd be like, I'm willing to give you $1 of fab so I don't have to put the $1 of fab on him on the waiver wire when you drop him.
Right.
But outside of that, like I'm not going to give you anything for that guy. I'm just going to go grab a different tight end off the waiver wire that nobody's ever heard of who got called up from the practice squad this week.
Right.
That's the sort of level that you can get into in a league like this where we're starting so many, the tight ends are getting 3 PPR and so you're able to just delve into these huge depths. And then the top tier guys match right up there with the running backs and the wide receivers. They're at the point where in 2023 we're looking at the tight end 1 didn't match because tight end 1 did not. The tight end 1 this past year, I mentioned at the beginning of the show, just never materialized. But if you look at multi-year WoRP, like where does that tight end 1 fit in? Oh, that tight end 1, he's right up there at the top of the entire thing minus running back 1. And that's just because this league also has points per carry involved in it.
Gotcha.
But
I mean, even like Evan Ingram was more valuable than Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts.
Yep. Tight end 2 in multi-year WoRP is higher than quarterback 2 and wide receiver 2. You just so you're looking at, can I have one of these super top tier guys? Yeah, and you can win with them. Right. And they're just that much more valuable, but the important thing is, okay, how is this league set up? I mentioned it has really unique settings in that it's start 1 quarterback, 1 running back, 1 wide receiver. So what did I do with my team in terms of how I built? I got myself a Justin Jefferson to fill in that wide receiver spot, get the number 1 wide receiver, a great way to go. I had a couple running backs that ended up turning into a Kyron Williams and a Rashad White and a Tony Pollard. So those guys could fill in that running back slot. And I had a Dak Prescott as my top quarterback, and I also had like a Baker Mayfield and a Derek Carr floating around. Mm-hmm. But then I ended up getting myself a ton of tight ends because I only needed to fill 1 of each of those 3 specific positions. So I ended up with like 4 or 5 guys at each position. But if I invested a ton into these tight ends that people didn't really know, but I drafted them before they would go in terms of like somebody's taking a flyer on your Greg Dulcich, on your Tyler Higbee, on your Daniel Bellinger. Like guys are going to take flyers on that in like the 18th round of your startup or whatever. So I just started drafting those guys in the 15th. And now all of a sudden I have this stable of a ton of tight ends that are giving me the WoRP value. And I found all this value in the really late portions of the startup. And so that helped roll my team into that year of, okay, I had all these guys. My floor of my team each week was extremely high because I just needed a couple tight ends to in my case, it actually ended up being more than a couple because the starting requirement's so long. But I just needed a bunch of guys to go out and catch 3 passes. It didn't matter how many yards they got. As long as they caught 3 passes, I was already getting 9 points. So that's the sort of thing that you can play around with, and it's where WoRP can show you where something is interesting, and it's where you have to see where something looks off. In this case, what I noticed when it looked off was I panned to the right, because usually if you pan to the right, it's a quarterback ends first, and then tight end ends pretty close to quarterback.
Right.
And then running back goes on for quite a while, and then receiver goes on for much longer. But in this case, the fact that tight ends went on for so long compared to the quarterbacks, and it almost got to where the running backs were basically at 0 WoRP, that was where I was like, hey, there's something going on here. There's a reason. There's an ability for me to extract value out of all these lower tier tight ends, and nobody else in the league is going to really pay attention to that and is going to roster these guys.
That's very interesting for that league. I'm sure it's not like that for every single league, but a league like this, if you have like crazy tight end scoring like this one does, you can probably do that in most of those leagues. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, but if this was a lineup league, it would be totally different. Because now I need to choose the tight ends every single week. I would be investing a ton of effort into, can I get these top tier tight ends? Because when we look at lineup leagues, like it's much harder to best ball the running back position, but it's much easier to lineup league the running back position. So instead, I might be investing a ton into tight ends, because now all of a sudden, if I can have tight ends that are consistently, if I can have those Mark Andrews and those Travis Kelce's that are going to get 6 catches for 50 yards at a minimum, well, guess what? I just got myself 23 points at a minimum every single week.
Right.
And so those are the kinds of floor plays that you can then do in a lineup league based on this same scoring setting. Just you flip it from best ball to tight end. Whereas at best ball, I'm avoiding the Mark Andrews and the Travis Kelce because I want those points into the running back, and then I'm just getting all these lower tier tight ends, and that's how I'm making up the points there.
Yeah,
so
sure.
It's you just change one aspect about the league, and yeah, best ball to lineup is a pretty big thing to change. But you change just one setting, and now everything flips on its head.
Yeah, just changing that one little setting, man, it'll completely change it. Like you said, that's just how you go about doing your a startup with the settings. Either lineup or best ball would completely change how you would draft the whole draft, basically. So yeah, that is very interesting on that one. That might be a league where we might have to make this one a lineup one and see what happens. That'd be interesting. So, pretty cool. All right, well, that is all the leagues we have to look at. As you've been watching this here, we've been using the Koopa's WoRP tool the whole time here. We do have a little discount going on right now if you are not signed up for the WoRP tool yet. As you can see at the top here, click here, use code DRAFTSEASON at checkout. You get 20% off the WoRP tool. I believe that's going to go through the whole NFL draft season here. So, yeah, if you haven't signed up for the WoRP tool, you want to give this a try, check it out for your leagues. Here's the little code here, right at the top of the homepage. Use code DRAFTSEASON at checkout. You'll get 20% off the WoRP tool to use. It's a great tool to use. I've been trying to display it here the last couple months here for quarterbacks, running backs, wide receiver, tight ends this month. So you guys have seen a lot of what we've talked about on here and how you can use it and different ways to use it for your leagues, for startup leagues, for your own leagues that you have going on now, and you can kind of roster construct properly from there. So definitely a great tool to use. And then another thing that we wanted to talk about here real quick before we get into America's favorite game is one of our new sponsors. It's called Ultimate Autographs. Really cool It's a live sports memorabilia break on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook. They're all on there. They do it at different times, but really cool stuff here. I watched Mike bought a bunch of spots, and he got a bunch of cool stuff. He got a full size Jerome Bettis autographed helmet. He got a Chad Johnson autographed helmet. He won a special Mike Tyson autograph photo. He's won a bunch of stuff on there from Mike. Just watching his breaks, really, really cool stuff. So yeah, you can go on there, like him on YouTube and all that. We do have a referral code. If you check the episode description for this episode, I'll have the link in there. It's ultimateautographs.com with the referral code. Your referral code is Harmon15. You'll get 15% off your checkout to save on your orders. Like I said, you can get into these live breaks. And it's all kinds of sports: baseball, MLB, NFL, all that good stuff is on there. So you can get all kinds of stuff. And then like they have some variety ones too, multi-sport mixers, all that good stuff, man. So there's all kinds of good things there. I'll post it up in the in our podcast description if you want to check out more of that.
Yeah, and the direct link for South Harmon affiliate. It's signed shit. Signed sh.it. Go to that link. It'll take you right to our referral link, and
Okay.
you can go right in through there.
You're teaching me new things here. So yeah, you can go ahead and use that. That's a really cool new partnership that we partnered up with here recently. I'm excited to have them aboard with us, and definitely cool, something to check out. I've been watching a couple of their live breaks, so really cool stuff that they have on there. I'm gonna have to jump in some on some for you here soon. All right, America's favorite game. You ready?
Yep.
All right, we might as well, since we're talking wide receiver, tight ends. Who's your favorite wide receiver, and who's your favorite tight end NFL? You could be current or all time, whatever you want to talk about.
So my favorite wide receiver to watch was Reggie Wayne.
Reggie Wayne,
I loved it. He was never that guy that he's gonna take the top off the defense, but Reggie Wayne was that guy that he's gonna find his way open, and Peyton Manning's gonna throw that ball and it's gonna land right in his hands. And it was one of those things where anytime I was watching the Colts, it's like, all right, here comes Reggie Wayne. It's a critical situation. They've got to throw the ball down the field. It's like, where is he? He's gonna pop open at some point, and that ball's gonna get to him. Yeah. And it was beautiful to watch that him play. And when Manning ended up leaving, and he had Andrew Luck throw in, he also did really well with him too. And it was just beautiful watching him play. One of those almost, hey, this guy's one of those people that just in the same way that I don't know if you've ever watched historical footage of watching Willie Mays run, mm-hmm. but Willie Mays, people thought he wasn't running at full speed when he was, because his jaw, it was just so graceful. And that's right. Just how I felt watching Reggie Wayne. You'd be like, I don't know how he just got open, because it just looked like he just ran a route and the defender just lost him somehow. But he was just that good that he just looked so smooth going and running his routes and finding holes in the defense.
Absolutely. My wide receiver, I've always been a big A.J. Brown fan, so that's always been one of my favorites. I love the way he plays the game. Historically, I would say, oh man, there's a bunch of those. One that I always liked watching, even though he's a freaking Steeler, was Hines Ward. And it was because he played differently than a lot of the other wide receivers. He was the best blocking wide receiver in the NFL. You can run to his side. He'd have that big fucking goofy smile on his face while he was blocking you. Just a really hard-nosed, really good player. He wasn't some 4-4 burner or anything. He's a former quarterback at Georgia, converted over to wide receiver. He wasn't fast, but the dude could just get open. He played hard. Always enjoyed watching Hines Ward play. He was always a really good player that I always liked. I always liked Torrey Holt. Torrey Holt was a favorite of mine. Steve Smith, obviously. Chad Johnson, I always loved watching. Just his, obviously, celebrations, but he was a hell of a player, too. Just, playing. Terrell Owens, I liked there for a while, and then he became a dickhead, and that was it for me on him. Gosh, yeah, there's so many wide receivers. I can't even really think of them off the
I've
top
got
of
a
my head,
fun trivia fact for you. All
Okay.
right, which Hall of Fame wide receiver has more tackles than drops?
has more tackles than drops. Ooh. That one, I have no idea on that one.
Larry Fitzgerald.
Oh, okay.
They did new into the Hall of Fame 2024 class, so he's a Hall of Famer now. I mean, I don't think he's been officially inducted, but whatever. I'm calling him a Hall of Famer. He is one. But yeah, he has more tackles in his career than drops because he dropped so few passes. It's another one of those guys that's just like he it's just amazing watching him play. Like that slant in the Super Bowl where he just like caught the slant and just went right up the middle and just turned that into a touchdown. Like one of the most beautiful plays I've ever seen by a wide receiver.
Absolutely. Yep. He had one. Steve Smith had one against the Rams in a playoff game. I think it was, I want to say it was the first overtime. I looked that up. He just caught a slant over the middle and unfucking touched up the middle, gone. He was incredible. Yeah, there's so many good wide receivers. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch right now, but I always like the Wes Welkers, the Julian Edelmans, Danny Amendolas, those type of guys too. Always really enjoyed watching those guys play too. And then what about tight end? You got a favorite tight end of all time?
So growing up a Ravens fan, I was in the right era for this. There's something about shouting "heap" every single time Todd Heap caught a pass. I just loved the fan experience of that, and eventually, and of course, you were going against the Steelers, who always had Heath Miller, so they were always shouting Heath back at us, and then eventually Todd Heap went over to the Steelers, and it was like, as a Ravens fan, when he catches the ball for the Steelers, do you still say it or do you not? Like, but I just loved that experience around him. I know he wasn't like the best tight end in the world, but just hey, every time he catches the ball, the whole stadium is all going Heap. Like that was just fun to be a part of.
Right. I was always a big Antonio Gates fan. Like, he just kind of came out of nowhere, man, but that dude was just absolutely fun to watch, dominant. Obviously, Tony Gonzalez was great. Always really liked watching, I can't think of the name off the top of my head right now. It just blanked on me. Anyways, some other ones that I know, like Njoku right now, I like watching Njoku play for Cleveland. Obviously Travis Kelce, really good fucking player. Jason Witten was always a fun one to watch too. Like he just got it done every single time. My buddy was a big Green Bay Packers fan, so I always liked Bubba Franks. That was his guy. I don't know, just because his name was fucking Bubba. I don't know. So we always liked Bubba Franks. That was one of our guys that we always liked too. But yeah, if I had to choose like one historically all time, it'd be Gates. And travesty that he didn't get in on the first ballot this year.
Yeah, Gates is one of those guys. He definitely should be in the Hall of Fame. Like it is one of those things where it's like, okay, is somebody able to get in on the first ballot? Luckily, it doesn't matter too much. Like they'll get into the Hall of Fame eventually, but Antonio Gates is one of those guys that's like, just watching him play for so long and just see how dominant he was, and I'll just see what a freak he was too. Like he was just one of those guys that if the ball was going in his direction, he caught it. And there's not that many guys that, no matter where the defender is around him, how he's like draped over him, whether he's reaching over in front of the defender to grab the ball, like uh, watching those guys play is tons of fun because it's just like
Yeah.
this is a physical freak out here
Right.
on this football field.
Right. The one I was blanking on was Gronkowski. I don't know why I blanked on Gronkowski, but watching Gronk has always been sweet. Another one that I always really liked, going back to your Colts days, was Dallas Clark. He was always
Hmm.
fun to watch with Peyton and those. He had a great connection with Peyton. Um, but yeah, there's so many good tight ends in the league too, that I've liked over time. So another fun position for sure.
Yeah, and it's also fun sometimes just to see like the guys that like I like watching George Kittle just
Yeah.
because like watching him throw some blocks is
Yeah.
it's really satisfying to see someone that's not like 350 pounds blocking a 350-pound guy.
All right.
And he does it well. He's really good at sealing the edge. He's really good at shedding off of a block and getting downfield in front of his runners. Like it's just it's fun to watch him just because he's so good at all aspects of that position.
Right. Right. Yeah. And we could probably go on for another hour just talking about random wide receivers and tight ends. I know I could always do that.
There's so many wide receivers and tight ends. I mean, and we could delve down like uh, all sorts of guys where like if you were in a league that had kick return yards, how many people would have Devin Hester on their team?
Devin Hester, right?
Like
I was always a big, even when he was in Miami, I always liked Jarvis Landry too. Jarvis Landry was another one I always really liked too. So, yeah, there's like I said, we could go on for hours and hours on that one. So, but no, I appreciate you coming on here again, Koopa. I know we recorded this a little early this time, so I appreciate you jumping on here with me. Had a lot of fun as usual. Yeah, we'll definitely connect with you again here after the draft, probably. Be doing a bunch of drafts here, like you said, here soon on the before NFL drafts, and then when the NFL draft actually gets here, we'll be doing some drafts as well. So we'll look at some of the talk about some of the rookies. I know we have another plan for another series that we're going to do after the draft as well, so that'll be cool. Looking forward to that. So appreciate having you on again, man.
Yeah, and keep an eye out for it's either has just happened or it will be happening within the next week. Is the launch of my podcast as well.
Right. Yeah.
It'll
definitely
be the
follow that.
Grinding the Edge podcast. Like keep an eye out for that on the podcast feed. So
Yeah, it'll be on the podcast feed. And then you're at Dynasty Koopa on Twitter as well, so make sure you guys give him a follow there. You can follow me at Eric Vanek NFL. Follow the show at America's Game Pod as well. So that is it for this week's episode number 36. We will be back next week with episode 37, and we're going to go through some of the wide receiver and tight end prospects in the upcoming draft here and kind of get a look at some of those guys. So once again, we'll see you guys next time. Peace.